Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're once again really fortunate to have Kent Mathewson with us. Kent has a really rich background in the history of our field, and he has been really responsible for crafting some of the history himself. And we're going to talk about a little bit of that. But what we're really interested in is Kent's perspective on the University of Wisconsin in the 70s and the 80s. Kent, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Here I am in smoky Chautauqua County, New York, where I've retired, and we're in the midst of the, for historical sake, we're in the midst of the great Canadian smoke cloud that's come to the eastern coast. And,
and everybody thinks the Canadians are innocent, huh? They think they're nice people, and look at this.
It's thrown a tremendous wrench into my prediction that the Great Lakes states, especially those counties, I call them the North Coast counties that have a lakeshore on one of the Great Lakes, will become the prime place for climate refugees to resettle. I'm not after this, after the blizzard in Buffalo, and now this smoke cloud coming from Canada. Maybe it's not quite the prime place, but at any rate,
maybe not. But Kent, you and I had talked before about having this second episode. You're the first one here to be interviewed twice, but. Again, you have so much to offer, and we're hoping that you can talk about, your experiences at the University of Wisconsin in a little more detail. And I recall we had discussed certainly one of the giants in the field, Richard Hartshorne, and some of the academic debates he had engaged in. Can you care to talk about Hartshorne and some of the debates, conflicts, perhaps even that emerged?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, let me give it a little bit of the context of the history of the department. It's founded in 1928, as I remember. Actually, the same year as LSU, where I spent 30-some years, but teaching. But throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was. One of the top departments, but after World War II, I think it for a while was rated number one by the National Research Council. Mm-hmm. And that was partially because, or maybe largely because of at least three of their faculty members. Richard Hartshorne, who became the premier historian of the field with his Nature of Geography in 1939, published in 2 volumes of the Annals and later published as a separate book. And then Glenn Trewartha, the climatologist.
Indeed.
And then also Robinson, who was the premier cartographer. And the three of those figures had been in the OSS during the war. Many geographers were with the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. And I think they got kind of a sense of entitlement possibly as a result of that. And they were joined in the early 50s by Andrew Clark. Andy Clark became significant figure in his own right, and he had also been in the war. I'm not sure that he was in the OSS. He may easily have been. Certainly, he was involved in counter-espionage, and as you mentioned a little bit earlier to me before we started, he went famously over the hump from Burma into China, and you said with Zhou Enlai. I did not know that, but very possibly. I know Yi Fu Tuan used to talk about sitting on Zhou Enlai's knees as a very, very young boy. His father was a diplomat who left during the war, actually, went to Australia. And that's obviously Yi Fu Tuan is a very late addition to to the very prominent geographers who were at the University of Wisconsin almost at the end of when I was finishing up my PhD in the mid 80s. But tracing back then, in the 1950s especially, after Hartshorne's publication Nature Geography, use the pun, put the department on the map. It was there before, and especially Hartshorne didn't have that many students. Trewartha had some. Robinson had quite a few cartographers, but it was Andrew Clark really that had a school. If anyone had a school formed at Wisconsin, it was Andy Clark with his historical students, many of them from the UK or the British Empire. He was originally Canadian, Prince Edward Island, but he really had a good recipe in a way. He would at the beginning he had students do regional monographs, like Roy Mehrens of North Carolina and Mitchell in Virginia.
Shenandoah Valley, yeah.
Yeah, Shenandoah Valley, Jim Lemon in Pennsylvania, the best poor man's country, and so on. And after doing a regional monograph, it was pretty logical they would get a job at one of the state universities in that state. So that was a good recipe. And he had, I forget, maybe 20 some PhD students, maybe more. We kind of finished that last interview with me talking about Antioch College and its small but significant program. I was always, and you asked me quite a bit about how I became a geographer. Early interests in it, stamp collecting and reading history and geography and so on. But I went to Antioch College. They had a small geography program. I graduated and then spent 2 years actually as an environmental studies coordinator. Not quite sure where I wanted to go to grad school, and met a couple of people who had associations with the University of Wisconsin. Daniel Gomez Ibanez came to Antioch and taught 1 year as he was finishing his dissertation under Andy Clark in Hartshorne. And a couple of other people, and so I had kind of an entree and was offered a research assistantship, and that was very attractive. I was thinking Berkeley and UCLA and UBC, but this offer came through, and so I took it. I really wanted to go work with Jim Parsons and be in Carl Sauer's department. But Jim said, well, I have a student, Bill Denovan at Wisconsin. You can't do better than that. And and he was right. So I actually, though, I decided, well, I was going to become a Latin Americanist. I really needed to see more of Latin America before I started grad school. So I asked if I could delay my entry by a year. They said, okay, we'll keep your assistant or your research assistantship open. And off I went first to Mexico to Cuernavaca and did some more language study there for the fall. And then the idea was to go all the way down to Patagonia, get to Tierra del Fuego, and also see what was going on in Chile. This was 1972, and maybe get in trouble down there. Join the Allende forces. And actually, I had credentials from the IWW. I joined the IWW in the late '60s. Part of the left. So I actually did have credentials from the industrial workers of the world as someone, a representative to go get contact with the anarcho-syndicalists in Chile.
And you had an Antioch degree, which was even better in some ways.
That's right. That certified me as a radical right there.
Yeah, I'm telling you, huh? You had Yellow Springs written all over you.
That's right. That's right. And so off I went, off with the girlfriend, and we were going to go down to, and then I was going to start in the fall. Well, I got a phone call in Mexico from Bill Denovan saying, you better get back up here and start in January because your research assistantship has evaporated. You were going to be working with David Cronin, who was William Cronin's father, the historian. And he had levitated up to deanship and was no longer going to be doing this research that I was going to be involved with. So I made hasty plans to turn around and came back to Wisconsin. I came in a bit late, a couple of weeks late, in January, and kind of parachuted into a couple of courses, Denovan's Amazon course and Don Thompson, archaeologist, antique course, and then the History of Geography seminar with David Ward and Bob Sack. And
So you were in David Ward's course. David Ward was a student.
No. This is he
was
had already
teaching the
been
history.
a
Okay.
professor. Yeah.
Okay.
As was Bob Sack,
Right.
assistant
Okay.
professor at that
Right.
thing. Yeah. And they were doing a joint history of geography seminar. Nick Entrican was in it. Forget who. Billy Lee Turner was off doing his field work. Actually, I would have been doing field work with Turner in Yucatan had that research assistantship come through. That was the idea. And then I was actually staying with Dan Gomez Ibanez when I first got to town, and then with the Denovans, and then got my own lodging. But I wanted to make up for lost time and make a good impression. And so I think it was the second or third meeting, they said, well, who's going to cover the Hartshorn-Schaefer debate? And no one raised their hand. You would have thought maybe Nick Entrican would have, but so I raised my hand. The new student, green as could be, new to grad school, coming in late, and so. But I had, or I thought I had read or had actually looked at Nature of Geography at Antioch. It was on one of the shelves in the office, and. So I thought, oh, well, this can't be that difficult. And so I said yes. And so they met on Tuesdays. And so, I had the rest of the week to read Nature of Geography, and then also Fred Schaefer's famous article where he lambasted Hartshorn and regionalists in general, and flew the flag of extreme positivism and so on.
And then had the gall to pass away shortly after its publication.
That's right, which infuriated Hartshorn for the rest of his life. Quite seriously. I talked to Hartshorn about that. So at any rate, then I ran into somebody that I'd known at Antioch, and that weekend I said, well, let's go out and find some polka music, go to a bar. So we went to a bar, and boy, that sabotaged the weekend pretty badly in terms of plowing through Nature of Geography again, and reading Schaefer's polemic. That's what Hartshorn called it, or I called it in my little prospectus that I had to pass out, mimeographed in the purple mimeograph paper. At any rate, got to be Sunday, and I started reading Nature of Geography, and I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to get through this. Let me read Schaefer's article, and it was crisp. It was polemical. It was well written, very strident, and I thought, wow, maybe I'll really pull a clever one here. I'll come out and kind of argue as a devil's advocate the side for Schaefer, and it's only 30 pages. I'll get through this. And along comes Tuesday, and I'm Ward, I remember, says, okay, and then Bob Sack, I remember, said. Ward said, "Who's covering the Schaefer Hartshorn debate?" He didn't remember, and Bob Sack said, Bob often had a bit of a stutter, actually. It's the new student, Mathewson here, and Ward looked up. Oh yes, okay, well proceed. And then Bob Sack said, "Well, wait a minute, wasn't Dick going to join us?" Oh my God. I had heard that Hartshorn had gone to the University of Minnesota, where he had taught earlier, way back, and he was a visiting professor there that semester. Well, this was on the fourth floor of the old science building, and there was a long hall where all of the retired faculty had their offices. Trewartha and Robinson and Hartshorn and some others, and then some of the grad students had offices up there too. And that's where the seminar room was, also on that fourth floor. And the door was open, and you could see down the long hall. And Bob had a very characteristic gait. I remember him sort of very purposefully walking this down the hall to Hartshorn's bump, bump, bump on Hartshorn's door. And all of a sudden, as I was looking, because I had a view of it, I said, "Oh my God, Richard Hartshorn is coming." So, oh my God! And the law. It's one of those events where time stops and you see you see the end. You see your demise. Kind of like Billy Budd. I was aphasia. No, I couldn't say anything. I thought. And Hartshorn sits down and we get introduced and so forth. And he said, and then Sack or Ward, proceed. And I started stammering. Just stammering. I don't remember. It's one of those things you don't remember what you're saying. It's just words come out. And who knows? I'm sure it was just nonsense, blather. And but being a seminar, people were not all that attentive. They were probably thinking about other thing, and thank God, probably not listening too closely to what I was saying. And so at some point, I blurted out, "Is that correct, Professor Hartshorn?" "Well," he said, "well, it was not quite that way." And off he took for the next 30 minutes. I was not actually able to say anything, thank God. And I just sat there and I thought, well, my career in graduate school had almost ended a week or two in. So that was the, and I actually, we had to prepare, let's see, what do they call it? A précis. Bob Sack called it a précis each week, a page in which we made commentary about the readings that we had for that week. And we passed it around to everybody, and we had the little mimeograph machine. And mine was, thank God I'd done mine on that Sunday. And it was very critical of Schaeffer. And I had said something about a polemic. Years later, when Hartshorn was cleaning out his office, he came across it. And at that time, as a grad student, I was across the hall from him. I'd see him from time to time. And he recognized me, and he called me over and said, "You know that précis that you wrote for that seminar in which you called Schaeffer's so-called article a polemic? You were absolutely right. It's one of the best things that has been written about it." So, boy, that was a gold star from Richard Hartshorn.
Well, you got a gold star from him.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Yeah, I met him once. I met him at the 1984 AAG in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. Interesting, shook his hand, and was not very daunting physically, but certainly an intellectual giant for sure. Yeah. And intellectually strong through his later years.
Yeah. Well, his brother, Charles Hartshorn, was a professor at the University of Texas, and he I think he died at age 104. He was teaching almost up till the time he was 100. And he was a philosopher. I guess he was one of the foremost authorities on metaphysics. So I always wondered how that influenced Hartshorn.
One other aside that I think is valuable is I remember Brian Barry told me early in his career, and he was discussing the quantitative approach in geography, and he discussed it in a number of venues. And one place was at Wisconsin, and it was Hartshorn that actually defended Barry's perspective. And he and Hartshorn would often be seen at AAG meetings together, and people would consider them rather an odd couple because of their different views vis-a-vis geographical traditions.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, we'll get into the quantitative revolution now because that's the other thing that we were talking about before, Bungay and Hartshorne. And actually, Hartshorne was, you might say, a soft positivist. He wasn't a militant, a strident positivist like many of the, like Berry and Bungay and the so-called Garrison Raiders. That's what Bungay used to call him because he was also
right.
Very pro William Lloyd Garrison and so forth. But Hartshorne was he was a soft positivist, I think. He wasn't anti-positivist, but he did, of course, champion regionalism and chorology, and that, I guess, was seen as being oppositional to the quantitative revolutionaries and so on. But Bungay, I had some interaction with Bill Bungay, and it goes back to Antioch. He was invited by one of the temporary geographers, Tom Glennon. Lasted only about a year. He was a graduate of the University of Washington and knew Bungay and invited him down from Detroit. This was when Bungay, I think, was still teaching at Wayne State.
Wayne State.
Fired, and he came and gave a lecture on his fairly far out quantitative methods or quantitative geography models, inflected with his politics, but mostly it was hardcore quantitative geography. That certainly wasn't my cup of tea, but I remember it was interesting. And he asked me, he asked all the students where they're from, and I said, Detroit. He said, oh, Detroit. My parents we had moved, my father was city manager and moved to Detroit in 1963. And so this is the late 60s when Bungay came down, probably 68, and to Antioch. And Bungay, and I said, well, my father's involved in some urban research and so forth there. And so Bungay apparently filed that away. And that Christmas vacation, I was home, and we got a phone call. My father answered it, and he kind of held the phone out like this and said, eventually said to me, he said, "Do you know a Dr. Bungay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, Professor Bungay. He came to gave us a talk about a month ago," and he said, well, why don't I put you on the phone? And Bungay then comes on and said, Kent, yeah, I'm talking to your father. You live out there in the suburbs. You've got 2 cars. I want you to get him to sell one of them. We need some money for the Detroit geographical expedition right now. I said, well, I'm sorry, Dr. Bungay. I don't think, even though it's Christmas season, I don't think that's going to happen. So that was my second interaction with Bungay. Third was, a few years later, I'm in graduate school. And Bungay, of course, was at Wisconsin. I believe he was going to study with Hartshorne. Of course, he got in big wrangles with Hartshorne, and I think it was Trewartha who had a very famous oral exam in which you really had to, what is the climate type of, some very obscure location in Patagonia or something, and if you didn't know it, you failed. And Bungay, I think, stormed out and went over and was working with Reed Bryson in meteorology. Mm-hmm. Then off to, I guess, off to Washington and so on. But he would periodically come through Madison. I think his daughter was living there as well, and he would show up at the department and sort of. Like Luther on the steps of the cathedral, and reading the nailing it on the door, and so It was always, oh my God, the departmental secretary, oh my God.
Bunge's
Bill
blabber
Bunge.
on the
Yeah, right.
on the door of Madison.
And so he would always demand, and he did this several times. He'd demand, a special session where he would give a lecture to the department and so on. So Bob Sack was the chair of the speakers committee that particular semester when this incident really happened, and he said, "Well, I'm sorry, but we were booked up for the whole semester. However, maybe the geography club could sponsor you." And then Ward said, "Well, the geography club is moribund." Apparently, I used to joke, which is true. I think Michael Conzen might have been the last president before it got dissolved by cannabis smoke on the inside of the building and tear gas on the outside. Because in the late 60s, with Madison in complete revolt, the geography club went up. And and Sack said, "Well, maybe it could be resurrected." And of course, I volunteered. And I said, "Yes, yeah, why not? Why not? And we'll sponsor. I know Bill Bunge. We'll sponsor his talk." And then Ward said, "Well, we need to name it something." And I said, "Well, since Bunge's this big radical, why don't we name it for one of the radical geographers?" And I said, "How about Kropotkin?" And Ward kind of laughed, and because actually he had read some Kropotkin, and he said, "Well, I don't know. Kropotkin's fairly well known." I said, how about Alice Reclus and the greater obscurity principle at that time? Reclus wasn't as well known. And so it became the Alice Reclus Geography Club. And Bunge kind of liked that. And so Bunge gave his talk and thoroughly made everybody uncomfortable, especially Sack, because he had been engaged in actually debates in the annals with Sack. Oh boy. And so, but Sack being very polite and gentlemanly like, he invited Bunge, said, "Well, where are you going to stay tonight, Bill?" And well, I'll stay with the people, with the students. Nobody had volunteered to put him up for the night. And so once again, I innocently raised my hand. We'll do that. And so he said, yes. And so off went. So Greg Knapp and I took Bill Bunge off to the 602 Club, which was the sort of graduate school hangout in Madison. And where all the radicals and so on, grad students hung out. And I used to say it looked like kind of the prole bar, not the troll bar. Today it'd be troll bar. Prole bar in 1984, the last place where the English language was still known in its more pristine forms, and all the consciousness had not been sanitized. So I used to joke, the 602 will be the last place after 1984 where unmediated by state discourse would take place. So Bunge kind of liked that, and then we used to hitchhike always, even at midnight. Actually, that's the best time to hitchhike because it was bar time. Everybody was going, and they picked you up. And so I lived down at where I had rented a house was at 502 South Park, and by total coincidence, the geography building, the old Science Hall, was at 502 North Park Street. So we used to joke about that, the fulcrum of the two places. And so off we went to my place, and I had fixed up a big bed in the basement, and then I had a little cubby hole upstairs, and I was going to give him what was the luxurious guest room in the basement. But it was a very low ceiling, right next to the furnace, and Bunge was tall, and he came kind of erupting up out of the basement, said, This is just disreputable. Your parents should be paying for it." Much better. Bunge came from a fairly wealthy family,
right? And
I think that was part of his psychological makeup, his Freudian dispute with his banker father. But so motivated much of him, I'm sure. I said, "Oh well, no, we're living like the people here." And so Bunge then decided that he was going to sleep on this couch in the really small living room in this flat, and he, being so tall, he kind of his feet hung over one side and his head over the other, and I was renting out rooms there. I guess there were 3 rooms, and one of them was an undergrad. Normally I had grad students, but this time it was undergrad. Stockstad fellow, and he came in the next morning. He didn't realize that we'd come in about 1 o'clock, and this was strange man was sleeping on the couch. He thought maybe he was homeless or something. And he said, "Who is this character?" And I said, "Well, that's Dr. Bill Bungay, one of the most famous geographers in the world." He was, had to explain a little bit later who Bungay was to this fellow. He was rushing off the class.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that was. I think I had some other run-ins with Bungay at various other times, but those are the notable ones.
It's interesting, and he certainly has a reputation in our discipline. I remember talking to Waldo Tobler about his time at Washington. My goodness, probably about 15, 17 years ago, I was talking to Waldo, and he told me even then he would exchange Christmas cards with Bill Bungay, and they would communicate at least once or twice a year, even that recently,
Well, Bungay was a ferocious correspondence. I used to get just totally unsolicited 2- and 3-page typewritten. He would have not survived the let your fingers do the talking, all the digital texting.
Apparently,
no.
But that was that's certainly an important episode in your life. Really, was this interaction you've had with this rather illustrious figure in our discipline, And there's so much more as well. Kent, with just about a minute to go, I'm going to ask you to think about Wisconsin in particular. And if you could think about one or two of the things that you really took away from your Wisconsin graduate school experience, either good or bad, what are one or two of the things just come to mind that you'd like to share?
Things. Yeah. Our first session, I said probably the most important thing was what I learned from my peers.
Sure, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then later, after this, the South Park Street, then I went to Ecuador for a couple of years and came back and kind of had another house that I ended up sort of being in charge of. And we named it the Edgewater Geographical Society. And we had a number of geographers have gone on, Tim Cresswell and Matthew Edney and a number of geographers live there and were in residence, and so that was great. We had about 6 different rooms there, and so we that was great. Informal seminars. The other thing that you had mentioned a little bit earlier, maybe I have 1 minute or two,
sure,
is the Karl Butzer. He was hired in early 60s, along with Jonathan Sauer was there, and Simoons, and all three of them in 1966. I think they were all somewhat disaffected by the triumvirate, or the quadrant of Hartshorn, Trewartha, and Arthur Robinson, along with Andy Clark, who really ran the place, perhaps with this OSS military top-down demeanor. It didn't suit them, so they all actually left at the same time. They were offered positions at LSU by Jess Walker, who was the chair at the time. And in some ways, that was the biggest, I would say that was the largest sort of raid, maybe in the history of geography. And both Simoons and Sauer, I think we talked about this in the other session, stayed briefly at LSU. Butzer did not.
Butzer went to Chicago.
Went to Chicago, yeah. And I do remember one anecdote from David Hewson said that he was interviewing also at Wisconsin at the time, at Berkeley, but Andy Clark had taken him somewhat aside and said, "Well, I'm not so sure about assistant professors getting tenure here. Some of the Ivy League used to have that practice, like Harvard, never tenure assistant professor. They have to go away and then come back." And maybe Wisconsin was doing that as well. And he counseled Husen. He said, we have this young German geographer, Butzer. We're not so sure he'll be getting tenure.
Well, he certainly did, and then some. Interestingly, too, Yifu Tuan told me, I think he interviewed at Wisconsin early 1960s, and I think maybe it was Andy Clark that took him aside and said, don't share about these rather eclectic things you're considering engaging in, or you are engaged in, with regard to your scholarship, with regard to humanistic geography and things of that nature, was the inference, though it wasn't coined as such at the time. He didn't get the job, but later on he gets a distinguished professorship, much later in his career.
Absolutely.
And I think even Bill Denevan told me that he was warned early on with regard to his early years at Wisconsin that he should not expect to advance, and yet within several years of him being there, he becomes chair.
What happened with Bill was this. He had came from Berkeley in 60, I believe it was 66, and very, very quickly got a Fulbright, I believe it was Fulbright, to go to Peru for a year. Well, that was not something that was appreciated at all. In fact, I think Bill also was made, they wouldn't even let him teach an intro physical course. He had to be a TA as an assistant professor. This kind of demeaning, I guess, of the junior faculty was kind of really de rigueur there. But at any rate, he was down in Peru and he received a letter from Andy Clark saying that, you might as well just stay in Peru because your future here is very, very limited. But of course, he dug in his heels, as was Bill, to his great credit, totally tenacious. He came back. They waged a charm war with the faculty, as well as a flurry of publications. And so he survived.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, again, I think these are stories that must be told, but and we could go on and on for hours, Kent, but we're going to have to close for now. So I'm going to have to once again say thank you for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. Appreciate all you do, and hope you have a wonderful day and stay out of the smoke.
That's right. Yeah. And if we have a third session, I will bring some detergent for all the dirty.
Okay. This concludes today's episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.
Thank you.